Somewhere in the twisted double helix carried inside nearly 40 million Americans lies a record that no history book fully captures. It is a genome shaped not by a single homeland, but by a forced and violent convergence of hundreds of distinct peoples, a centuries-long collision with another continent, and a biology that had to adapt or perish. This is the story of why Black American DNA is, in a very real scientific sense, unlike that of any other population on Earth, not because of any myth of racial essence, but because of a documented, traceable history written into the genome itself. A continent, not a country. To understand what makes this genetic story so singular, the film must first correct a common misconception. There was never one African genome to begin with. Africa holds the deepest and widest human genetic diversity of any continent on the planet. Modern humans originated there roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, giving African populations far more time to accumulate genetic variation than any group that migrated outward. A person from Senegal and a person from Ethiopia can be more genetically distinct from each other than a Finn is from a South Korean. So when the transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported an estimated 12.5 million people out of West and Central Africa between the 16th and 19th centuries, it wasn't drawing from one gene pool. It was drawing from dozens of separate ethnic and linguistic nations: Wolof, Mende, Akan, Igbo, Yoruba, Congo, and many others, each with its own distinct genetic signature built over tens of thousands of years. Enslavers and traders, treating human beings as interchangeable cargo, threw these separate populations together on ships, on auction blocks, and on plantations, deliberately severing family and ethnic ties to make resistance harder. Populations that had rarely, if ever, interbred at scale in Africa were suddenly merged, generation after generation, inside a new and brutal environment. The result, over time, was something genuinely new. A population descending from an extraordinarily broad swath of West and Central African ancestry, blended together in a way that simply does not exist within Africa itself, where those groups have historically remained far more genetically distinct. The second layer, forced admixture. But African diversity is only the first layer. The second is harder to look at. Genetic research led by teams including scientists at McGill University examined DNA from thousands of African Americans and found that most of the European ancestry present in Black American genomes today did not arrive recently. It arrived generations before the Civil War, while slavery was still the law of the land in the American South. The genetic patterns are unambiguous. They show sustained mixing between enslaved Black women and white men for roughly a century before emancipation, mixing driven overwhelmingly by the power imbalance of slavery itself, including rape and coercion rather than choice. After the Civil War ended, that pattern of admixture dropped sharply, which researchers can see clearly in the generational timing embedded in the DNA. Genealogist and Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr., drawing on data from several DNA testing companies, has noted that a very large share of African American men can trace descent to a white male ancestor from the era of slavery, a lineage overwhelmingly rooted in coerced relationships rather than consensual ones. The genetic result is a population with an average ancestry that researchers estimate at roughly 80 to 85% African and a meaningful minority European component, with smaller traces of indigenous American ancestry in many individuals as well, the echo of another population violently displaced on the same continent. A map written in Ancestry. Percentages remarkably, this ancestry isn't evenly distributed. It follows the geography of American history itself, African Americans in Deep South states such as South Carolina and Florida tend to carry a higher percentage of African ancestry than those in border states like Kentucky or Virginia. Outside the South altogether, in the cities that absorbed the Great Migration of the 20th century, when roughly 6 million Black Americans left the rural South for the North, Midwest, and West between 1915 and 1970, the European ancestry fraction tends to be slightly higher still. In other words, the genome carries a faint but readable map of slavery's geography, of where plantations concentrated enslaved populations most densely, and of the great 20th century migration that reshaped where Black Americans live today. It is, quite literally, population history recorded at the molecular level. When history becomes biology, this unusual genetic mosaic hasn't just shaped ancestry, it has shaped health in ways researchers are only beginning to fully map. In 2011, a team at Johns Hopkins identified a genetic variant present in roughly a quarter of African Americans that appears to meaningfully lower the risk of coronary artery disease, the same disease that remains the leading cause of death across every American demographic. Individuals carrying this variant showed a markedly reduced likelihood of arterial narrowing compared to those without it. Other research has cut the other way. A large multi-institution study published in Nature Genetics identified a gene variant linked to elevated asthma risk that shows up almost exclusively in people of African descent, the first asthma risk signal of its kind found only in this population, according to the researchers involved. Neither finding is a verdict on any innate trait. Both are downstream consequences of population history. Which genetic variants happen to travel across the Atlantic? Which ones proved advantageous or neutral in a new environment? And which regions of the genome were shaped by the specific admixture events unique to this population? Understanding them has direct, practical stakes, better targeted treatments, better understood risk factors, and closing gaps in medical research that has historically underrepresented African-descended populations entirely. What the science does and doesn't tell us. It would be easy and wrong to read any of this as a story about inherent difference in ability, intelligence, or worth. It isn't. Modern human populations are far more genetically similar than different, and the vast majority of genetic variation exists within any given population, not between them. What the science actually shows is something more specific and, in its way, more remarkable. A population whose genome is a direct, measurable archive of an extraordinary and often brutal history, forced migration from dozens of distinct African nations, generations of coerced admixture during slavery, and a demographic reshaping through internal migration that continued into living memory. No other population on Earth carries precisely this combination, because no other population went through precisely this sequence of historical events. That is the sense in which the claim is true, not mystical, not deterministic, but historical and demographic, written into allele frequencies that scientists can now read with increasing precision. Every genome is, in a sense, a survivor's document. It carries forward only the lines that made it through disease, through displacement, through violence, through resilience. For Black Americans, that document happens to be unusually rich, stitched together from a continent's worth of distinct peoples and rewritten again by the specific, traceable history of slavery and migration in the United States. Science didn't invent this story. It simply learned, finally, how to read it. This piece is a factual synthesis of published population genetics research for narration or script use. It is written to reflect scientific consensus on ancestry and admixture, and does not endorse or repeat any claims of racial hierarchy or inherent group superiority. Modern genetics does not support such claims.